"Help my children live," begged the widow. The hunter said, "Be my wife, or you won't survive the night." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun had barely begun to set over the desolate plains of Wyoming, casting long shadows over the rugged landscape. The wind whipped through the dry grass, carrying the scent of earth and dust. In the distance, a small homestead stood alone, its wooden structure battered by time and the harsh elements. The widow, Mariah, stood on the porch of her cabin, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched her children close to her. They had been running for days, fleeing from a group of ruthless men who had terrorized their small town and now sought to claim what was hers. Mariah had always known that life on the frontier was tough, but she never imagined it would come to this, fighting to protect her children, knowing that if they were caught, their fate would be sealed. The cold wind made her shiver, but it wasn't the chill that made her tremble. It was the fear. Fear for her children's lives, fear for her own. She had heard the stories of what men like those did to women and children. They didn't care about mercy. They only cared about power and control. And now, it seemed that mercy was something she could no longer afford. Her only hope was to make it through the night. She needed help, someone strong enough to stand against the men who hunted her. As if on cue, the sound of hooves reached her ears. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned to see a lone rider approaching, his silhouette framed by the fading light. The horse's hooves beat steadily on the hard earth as the rider drew closer. Mariah held her breath, wondering if this was the moment when everything would change. She watched as the rider slowed to a stop in front of her cabin. The man dismounted with the ease of someone who had lived through 100 battles, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. His eyes were hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made her feel both uneasy and strangely relieved. "I can help you," the man said, his voice low and steady. "But you need to understand something first. If you want my protection, you'll have to make a choice. You'll have to become my wife." Mariah's breath caught in her throat. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. But as the man's gaze hardened, she realized that he wasn't offering her a choice in the matter. It was survival. "If you don't agree, you won't survive the night," he added, his tone unyielding. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had no other option. Her children's lives depended on it. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man's eyes softened, just for a moment. "It's simple. You stay with me, and I'll keep you and your children safe. Otherwise, you're on your own." Mariah felt a heavy weight settle on her shoulders. She had never imagined she would be forced into a situation like this. But here she was, with no other choice but to trust this man. The fate of her family rested in his hands, and now, she had to make the most difficult decision of her life. The man's words hung heavy in the air, his gaze unwavering. Mariah's heart raced as the gravity of the situation weighed on her. The decision she faced was not one of choice, but of survival. Her children were counting on her. The merciless men who had been hunting them were getting closer, and she could feel their breath on the back of her neck. Without this man's protection, she knew they would be dead before morning. Her body trembled as she processed the reality of what he was asking. It wasn't just protection. He wanted her to become his wife. She had always been a woman of principle, strong-willed, but this was beyond anything she could have ever imagined. She couldn't afford to be proud now. She had to survive, and so did her children. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes." The man nodded once, a look of approval flashing across his eyes. "Then follow me." Without another word, he turned and mounted his horse. Mariah hesitated only for a moment before gathering her children and following him. The night was growing darker, the temperature dropping as they rode deeper into the wilderness. They traveled in silence, the only sounds being the rhythmic thud of hooves and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. The hunter, as she had begun to think of him, did not speak again until they reached a secluded cabin in the foothills. It was a small, weathered structure, but it seemed solid enough. There were no signs of anyone else, no evidence of the raiders she feared. It was clear this man had been preparing for something, though she had no idea what. As they dismounted, he gestured for her to follow him inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a stone fireplace that had long since been extinguished. It was warm enough for the moment, but the absence of modern comforts was stark. "You'll be safe here for the night," he said, his voice softer now, though still firm. "The raiders won't find you here." Mariah stepped into the cabin, her children clinging to her sides. She looked around, unsure of what to expect. The man moved to the fireplace, starting a fire with ease, the flames quickly filling the small space with warmth. "You should rest," he continued. "I'll keep watch." Mariah nodded, but the unease in her chest refused to subside. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the strange turn her life had taken. She had gone from living a simple, albeit hard, life on the frontier to being thrust into a dangerous world she barely understood. She had placed her trust in this man, this hunter, but what did he really want from her? Was this truly just about survival, or was there something more? She could hear her children shifting restlessly beside her, their faces pale from fear. "Mama," whispered her young son, his voice trembling. "Are we going to be okay?" Mariah knelt beside him, pulling him into her arms. "Yes, darling," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or herself. "We're going to be okay." But even as she spoke those words, she knew that they were only as true as the night would allow. She glanced over at the hunter, who had settled near the door, his eyes scanning the darkened horizon through a small crack in the cabin wall. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his posture told her everything she needed to know. He was ready for whatever came next. The hours passed slowly, the crackling fire the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. Mariah tried to rest, but her thoughts wouldn't stop racing. She thought of her late husband, of the life they had built together, of the family they had lost. And now, here she was, in the company of a stranger who had promised her protection at the cost of her freedom. She couldn't help but wonder what his true intentions were. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the air thick with uncertainty. As the clock ticked past midnight, a low sound interrupted the stillness, a distant thud. Then another, and another. Her heart leapt into her throat as the noise grew louder. Someone was coming. The hunter's posture shifted, his hand moving toward the rifle resting against the wall. "Stay here," he whispered to Mariah, his voice low and steady. He didn't need to say more. She could see the warning in his eyes. The raiders were close. Mariah gathered her children in her arms, pulling them close as the hunter moved to the door, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the fire. He didn't look back as he stepped into the night, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the wind. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Mariah's breath caught in her chest. She knew this was the moment that would define everything. They were in his hands now. The night seemed to stretch endlessly as Mariah held her children close, the fire crackling weakly in the corner of the cabin. The sounds outside had stopped, but the silence was even more terrifying. She could feel the weight of the unknown pressing on her chest, her heart racing as her thoughts darted from one fear to the next. What had happened to the hunter? Was he still out there? The noise had stopped, but it had left an eerie stillness in its wake. She glanced at the door, then at her children. They were frightened, their wide eyes reflecting the same anxiety that churned in her stomach. "Mama, will he be okay?" her daughter whispered. Mariah stroked her hair gently, trying to steady her own nerves as much as her daughter's. "He's strong," she said, though her voice shook. "He's protecting us." She wasn't sure if she believed it herself, but it was the only comfort she could offer. The minutes dragged on, and just as she thought she couldn't bear the waiting any longer, the door creaked open. The hunter stood in the doorway, his silhouette tall and imposing against the dim light outside. His face was hard, unreadable, and for a moment, Mariah wondered if something had gone terribly wrong. But then he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the cabin, his gaze briefly softening when he saw her. "It's safe," he said, his voice low and steady. "For now." Mariah exhaled, the tension in her body loosening just a fraction. She could see he was still on edge, his movements quick and purposeful as he locked the door behind him. He made his way to the fireplace, stoking the fire with a few logs. Mariah watched him, her mind spinning. He had saved them, but she still didn't understand the full cost of what he had asked of her. She had agreed to become his wife, But what did that truly mean? Was it just a temporary arrangement for protection, or was he expecting more? She had no answers, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. The hunter noticed her gaze and looked up, his expression softening slightly. "You're wondering about the terms," he said, almost as if he had read her mind. "I don't expect anything from you other than your word that you will stay." His voice was calm, but there was a trace of something deeper in his eyes, something that spoke of years of solitude, of battles fought and lost, of burdens carried alone. Mariah nodded, though she still wasn't sure what to make of his offer. The reality of it all weighed heavily on her. She had come to this man for safety, for her children's sake, but now she had to make a new life with him. She could no longer rely on her old ways. The world had changed, and she had to adapt. She glanced at her children, who were now starting to settle, their eyes drooping with exhaustion. The hunter turned his attention back to the fire, stoking it once more. "I'll stay on watch tonight," he said, as if that were all that needed to be said. "Get some rest." Mariah wanted to protest, to insist that they could figure this out together, but the reality was that she was too tired to argue. The fear of the unknown had drained her of all strength. She knew her children needed rest, and so did she. She lay down beside them, her eyes heavy, but her mind still racing. She kept replaying the conversation in her mind, the man's words echoing through her thoughts. "Stay with me, and I'll keep you safe." Was that really all he wanted? Was it that simple? Mariah closed her eyes, trying to shut out the questions that filled her head, but the uncertainty lingered. As the fire crackled softly, the hunter remained by the door, his eyes watchful, alert. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the cold seeped in through the cracks in the cabin walls. But inside, there was warmth. For now, it was enough. The night passed slowly, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of the wind outside and the soft breathing of her children. Mariah eventually drifted into a fitful sleep, her body exhausted, but her mind still uncertain. She had placed her trust in this man, but would it be enough? The hours seemed to stretch on forever, and as the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls, Mariah awoke, still tangled in thoughts of the night before. The hunter was still awake, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. It was then that she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. This was her life now. She could either accept it or keep running. But running wasn't an option anymore. The first light of dawn crept slowly into the cabin, the soft glow filtering through the cracks in the walls. Mariah awoke, her body sore from the cold, hard floor, but the warmth of her children curled against her side provided some comfort. The previous night's tension still lingered in her mind, the words the hunter had said echoing in her thoughts. Was this really the safety she had sought? She glanced over at the man, still seated near the door, his eyes scanning the horizon with unwavering focus. He was as much a mystery to her as the world they now found themselves in. The uncertainty of her situation, her new life, pressed on her chest, but she knew she had no choice but to accept the reality. She had promised her children safety, and this man was the only one offering it. Mariah sat up slowly, careful not to disturb her children, who were still asleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of what came next. She had no idea how long they would remain in hiding or if the raiders would find them. But for the moment, the hunter had kept his promise. They were safe. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue that clung to her bones. Her stomach growled, reminding her of the meal she had not eaten the night before. The hunter had not shared much with her, but he had kept them safe. That much was undeniable. She stood, moving quietly to the small cooking area. The cabin was sparse, but it was enough for survival. The hunter had left some dried meat and beans by the fire, and she set about preparing a simple breakfast for her children. As she worked, her mind drifted back to her late husband. She had never imagined she would be in this position, relying on a stranger to protect her family. He was the one who had promised to take care of them. She had trusted him with everything. But now, it was a different man, a man with his own secrets, his own code of survival. A man who had never asked for her trust. The hunter's voice broke through her thoughts. "I'll need to go out for a while," he said, his tone flat. He had turned away from the door, looking directly at her for the first time that morning. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy. "Stay here," he added, his words carrying weight. "I'll be back soon." Mariah nodded, trying to mask the fear that stirred within her. She was starting to realize that the man who had offered her protection wasn't just some weary traveler. He had a purpose, a reason for being here, and it was tied to her survival. But what was it? What did he want from her beyond her promise to stay? As he stepped outside, Mariah felt the weight of the decision she had made. Her children would be safe, at least for now. But what about her? She had trusted him. But how much of that trust was based on her desperation? The fire crackled in the hearth, and she turned back to the meal she was preparing, her hands moving mechanically. She had no answers, only questions. The quiet of the cabin was broken only by the sounds of the children stirring. They were still too young to understand the dangers that lurked outside, but Mariah had no illusions about the world they lived in. The hunter had been their savior so far, but he was a man of few words. He didn't share his plans with her, didn't explain the details of what he was doing or why. He simply acted. Mariah wished for more than that. She wished for answers, for some sense of control in the chaos. But control was something she had lost long ago, and the price of survival was to let go of those illusions. The door opened again, and the hunter stepped inside. His presence seemed to fill the room, his rugged appearance and sharp eyes scanning the cabin. He didn't say anything right away, but there was a tension in his movements that spoke volumes. "We need to move," he said finally. "The raiders are closer than I thought. They won't give up until they find us." Mariah's heart sank, her worst fears confirmed. "How much time do we have?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not much," he replied. "We leave now. We can't afford to wait." He moved to the corner, gathering a few of his supplies. Mariah's mind raced, but she nodded. There was no time to question, no time for hesitation. They had to move. Her children were still groggy, but she quickly gathered their things and prepared them for the journey. She looked to the hunter for guidance, but he was already outside, his horse waiting. She followed him, her heart heavy with the uncertainty of what awaited them. The world outside seemed quieter now, but it was the silence of danger, the calm before the storm. Mariah mounted her own horse, her children holding on tightly behind her, and together they rode off into the unknown, the weight of their survival pressing down on them. The hunter had kept them alive, but the road ahead was uncertain. She could only hope that he was right, that they would find a safe place before the raiders found them. For now, that was all she could do. Hope and trust in the man who had taken them in, even if she didn't yet understand why. The sun had barely risen as they rode through the dense woods, the cool morning air biting at Mariah's face. Her children were huddled behind her, clinging to her with the exhaustion of a long, restless night. The sound of hooves was the only noise that accompanied them, breaking the silence of the wilderness. The hunter led the way, his silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of trees. He rode with an unwavering focus, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Mariah had learned by now that he was always alert, always watching. It was something she admired in him, though it also made her feel like an outsider in this new world she had been thrust into. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to him, something he wasn't telling her. He was a man of few words, and though he had kept his promise to protect them, he never shared much of his past or the reasons behind his actions. She had asked him once, but he had only said, "The past is for the dead. We focus on the present." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was the only one he gave. They had been riding for hours now, the sun climbing higher in the sky, when the hunter finally slowed his horse. He looked back at Mariah, his face hard. "We need to find a place to rest," he said. "The raiders could be anywhere, and we can't afford to keep riding like this." Mariah nodded, though her stomach churned with unease. She didn't know where they were going or what they would find when they stopped, but she had learned to trust the hunter's instincts. He had kept them alive so far, and that had to count for something. They rode for another mile before the hunter signaled them to stop. He dismounted and moved toward a small clearing by a stream. "This will do for now," he said. "Stay here and don't move. I'll check the area." Mariah didn't argue. She dismounted, helping her children to the ground. They were tired, hungry, and scared, but there was no time for rest. Not yet. The hunter had already disappeared into the trees, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As the minutes passed, Mariah's mind raced. What if the raiders found them? What if they were too late to escape? She couldn't afford to lose everything again. Not her children. Not her life. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the hunter returning. He moved with the same quiet precision as always, his presence barely a whisper in the wind. "We're safe for now," he said, his eyes scanning the clearing. "But we don't have much time. We need to keep moving." Mariah nodded, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her once again. There was no easy path ahead. She was relying on this man, this stranger, to guide them through this wilderness, but she didn't know where they were going or if he had a plan at all. She only knew that she had to follow him, for her children's sake. The hunter packed their things quickly, his movements efficient, as though he had done this 100 times before. Mariah watched him, feeling a strange sense of both relief and unease. He was the only thing standing between them and certain death, but she had no idea who he truly was. When he finished, he turned to her. "We ride at dawn," he said. "Get some rest." But rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her mind was too full of fear, too full of questions. She didn't know what lay ahead or how long this strange journey would last, but she knew that with each passing hour, the raiders were getting closer. And with them, the chance of survival grew smaller. As the day wore on, the hunter remained vigilant, keeping watch over their small camp. Mariah tried to sleep, but her thoughts kept her awake. She thought of the life she had lost, of her husband, of the home they had built together. She thought of her children, their innocent faces full of hope despite the world they had been thrust into. And she thought of the hunter, of his silent strength and the promise he had made to protect them. But promises could only last so long. Eventually, the danger would catch up with them. Eventually, the hunter would have to make a choice. And so would she. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the camp, Mariah gathered her children close and whispered a prayer. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she couldn't keep running forever. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would make it through. The sun had just risen, casting a pale golden light across the landscape, but Mariah barely noticed. The exhaustion from days of running, the weight of fear, and the unspoken questions still churned in her mind. They had made it through the night, but the hunter's warning lingered in her thoughts. "We ride at dawn," he had said, and now that the day had broken, they were already preparing to leave. She had barely slept, her mind racing with the uncertainty of their situation. There was no rest for her, not while the raiders were still out there, not while they were still running. The children were still asleep, their bodies curled up against her for warmth, unaware of the danger that surrounded them. Mariah sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. The hunter had already packed most of their belongings, his movements efficient as always. He had said nothing more than he needed to, just a few words to get them moving. But she could see the tension in his jaw. He was always on edge, always alert. She had come to respect that about him, but it also made her wonder who he really was. The man who had promised to protect her family was a stranger, a silent guardian, and she still didn't know the full extent of what he had endured. "We leave in 5 minutes," the hunter said, breaking her train of thought. His voice was as steady as always, but there was an urgency to it now. "Stay close, and don't make a sound." Mariah nodded, gathering her children, trying not to wake them too suddenly. She had to get them moving. They had no time to waste. The hunter led them once again, and this time, the air felt different. The weight of their pursuit, the knowledge that they were being hunted, hung over them like a dark cloud. The trees thinned as they rode, and soon, the open plain stretched out. Before them, the landscape was unforgiving, nothing but endless grass and the occasional rock outcrop. There was no cover here, no shelter from the elements or from their enemies. Mariah's heart beat faster as she scanned the horizon, wondering if they were truly alone or if the raiders were already closing in. She kept her eyes on the hunter, trusting that his instincts would guide them through this danger, but there was a nagging doubt in her mind. What if they were too late? What if the raiders had already found their trail? She pushed the thought aside. They couldn't afford to think that way. They had to keep moving, stay one step ahead of whatever was chasing them. The morning passed in silence, each mile feeling heavier than the last. The children had finally awoken, their small voices quiet and uncertain as they glanced around at the unfamiliar landscape. Mariah kept them close, reminding them that everything would be all right, even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. The hunter remained a few paces ahead, always looking ahead, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a sharpness that made Mariah uneasy. She could feel the tension in him, as if he were preparing for something, but he said nothing. They traveled for hours, stopping only when the hunter deemed it necessary. He never spoke of what he was looking for, what he was expecting. He was a man of action, not words. But Mariah could see it in the way he carried himself, the way he moved through the land with the confidence of someone who had been through countless battles. He knew the wilderness, and he knew how to survive. By late afternoon, they reached a small creek, its waters running clear and cold. The hunter finally stopped, signaling for them to dismount. "We'll rest here for a while," he said. Mariah didn't question it. She was grateful for the chance to rest, even if it was only for a short time. The children were tired and hungry, and she needed to find some food for them. "I'll get water," she said, moving toward the creek. The hunter watched her for a moment before nodding and turning his attention to the surroundings. As Mariah knelt by the creek, she filled her canteen, her thoughts swirling. The sound of the water rushing over the rocks was calming, but it couldn't drown out the fear that still gripped her heart. She thought of her home, of the life she had once known. It felt like a distant memory now, a life that was no longer hers. She had promised her children that they would be safe, but how long could they run? How long before the raiders caught up to them? How long before the hunter's protection ran out? She shook the thoughts from her head and returned to the camp. The children were huddled together, their faces tired and drawn, but they were alive. For now, that was enough. Mariah sat down beside them, the weight of the decision she had made settling heavily on her shoulders. She had put her trust in the hunter, but she still didn't know what it would cost her in the end. But for now, they were safe. For now, they had a chance. As the sun began to set, the hunter stood and looked around one last time. His eyes were sharp, his posture tense, as if he were waiting for something. "We leave at dusk," he said. Mariah didn't argue. She had learned by now that when he spoke, it was best to listen. They couldn't stay in one place for long. She glanced at her children, who were now resting, their small forms curled up against her. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows in the fading light. The night was coming, and with it, new dangers. But Mariah didn't know how much longer they could outrun their past. She only knew that they had to keep moving. The day had been long, and the night was beginning to settle in, casting shadows over the land. Mariah felt the familiar weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders, but this time, it was heavier than before. The hours they had spent traveling had taken a toll on them all. The children were exhausted, their eyes half closed as they clung to her, still unaware of the dangers that lurked just beyond their reach. The hunter moved silently ahead, his posture as tense as ever. His eyes scanned the darkening landscape, ever vigilant, always on alert. Mariah tried to steady her racing thoughts, focusing instead on the task at hand. The fire was small but warm, and she gathered her children around it, whispering comforting words to them in an attempt to lull them into sleep. She needed rest, but there was no time for rest. Not yet. The hunter had insisted they keep moving, even as the sun set, casting an eerie orange glow across the sky. "We can't stay here long," he had said, his voice as calm and steady as always. "The raiders will be out soon. We can't afford to be caught." Mariah had nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She trusted him, but a part of her still felt the weight of the decision she had made. She had promised to follow him, to protect her children at all costs. But with every step they took, the road ahead seemed more uncertain. As the night deepened, the sounds of the wilderness seemed to grow louder. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and pine. The fire crackled, but its warmth felt too small against the cold that had begun to settle in. Mariah wrapped her arms around her children, trying to offer them comfort, though she felt none herself. She glanced over at the hunter, who stood a few paces away, his eyes fixed on the distance. He had been quiet since their last stop, his thoughts hidden behind that stoic expression. She could see the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, the burden of keeping them all safe. She had seen it in his eyes before, the silent, unspoken promise he had made to her and her children. But she wondered if even he was truly prepared for what lay ahead. She had placed all her trust in him, but the questions continued to swirl in her mind. Who was this man? What did he want from her? And why had he chosen to help them? The sound of a twig snapping in the distance broke her thoughts. The hunter's head snapped up, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "Something's out there." Mariah's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively pulled her children closer. She tried to keep her breathing steady, though her chest felt tight with fear. The hunter crouched low, moving silently towards the edge of the clearing. He paused, his posture tense as he listened to the sounds around him. Mariah's eyes darted to the children, who had begun to stir, sensing the change in the air. She motioned for them to stay quiet, her heart racing. The tension in the air was thick, and Mariah's mind raced with fear. What if the raiders had found them? What if this was the end? The hunter remained still, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the sounds in the distance. A moment passed, then another. The crackling of the fire seemed louder than ever, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Finally, the hunter stood, his expression unreadable. "It's nothing," he said, his voice low but firm. "Just some animals. But we need to keep moving." Mariah exhaled slowly, her breath shaky. She had known it wasn't the raiders, but the fear had been real, nonetheless. The hunter didn't wait for a response. He moved toward their horses, his movements swift and efficient. Mariah gathered her children once again, feeling the weight of their dependence on her. She couldn't afford to hesitate, not now. They had come too far, and there was no turning back. The hunter was already mounted, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We move at first light," he said. "Get some rest while you can." Mariah nodded, but sleep was the last thing on her mind. Her thoughts kept racing, her mind unable to settle. She thought of their future, of the road ahead, and the choices that still lay before them. What would happen when the raiders found them? Could the hunter really protect them forever? She couldn't help but wonder how long he could keep up this charade, how long he could keep them safe before something broke. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her chest once again. As she settled beside her children, the cold of the night seemed to seep deeper into her bones. But there was no turning back now. She had made a choice, and she had to see it through. The hunter had kept his promise so far, and that was all she could ask for. For now, it had to be enough. She closed her eyes, the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant cries of animals filling the silence. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, but for tonight, they were still safe. For tonight, they could rest. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden hue across the landscape as the small group continued their journey. Mariah could feel the weight of the days pressing down on her, but there was something different about today. The air felt heavier, the silence around them more oppressive. The hunter, as always, moved ahead with purpose, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He had said they would leave early, but now that the day had broken, the journey felt even more uncertain. Her children were still sleepy, their faces pressed against her back, their small hands clutching her waist as they rode. Mariah's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, fear, and uncertainty. She could feel the raiders' presence in every rustling of the wind, every shadow that crossed their path. They had no way of knowing how much longer they could keep running. But for now, the only thing they could do was move. The hunter had kept them safe so far, but for how much longer? Her grip on the reins tightened as they rode, her thoughts still tangled in the same questions. What would happen when they eventually caught up to them? Would the hunter be enough to protect them? The road ahead was unclear, the dangers unknown. But one thing was certain, they had to keep going. The hunter never looked back, his focus unbroken. He seemed to be in his element, as though this was the life he was born for, always on the move, always ready to survive. Mariah had to admire that about him, even though it made her feel like a stranger in this world. He had no past, no history, just a quiet resolve to keep them safe. But it was a resolve that left her with so many unanswered questions. She had trusted him with her children's lives, but did he trust her? She didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. The hours passed, the landscape changing as they continued on. The dry, barren plains began to give way to rolling hills, the terrain growing more difficult to navigate. Mariah's horse stumbled once, throwing her slightly off balance, but she quickly righted herself. She could feel the fatigue settling into her bones, the lack of sleep making it harder to focus. But she couldn't stop. Not now. They had come so far, and she had promised her children they would be safe. She couldn't go back on that promise. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the temperature rose, the heat pressing down on them like an invisible weight. The hunter didn't seem to notice, his pace steady, his eyes always scanning the distance. Mariah could feel the sweat on her brow, the dust on her skin, but she pushed through it. There was no time for weakness, not now. They couldn't afford to be caught. The hunter finally slowed, signaling for them to stop. They were near the base of a rocky outcrop, the cliffs rising up in front of them, their jagged edges cutting into the sky. Mariah dismounted, grateful for the brief rest, and helped her children down. The hunter moved silently, circling the camp, his sharp eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, his voice low and practical. "But we don't stay long. We need to keep moving." Mariah nodded, her eyes scanning the terrain. She knew he was right. The raiders could be anywhere. They couldn't afford to linger, even for a moment. As the children settled on the ground, Mariah reached into her pack for the few scraps of food they had left. It wasn't much, but it was enough to quiet their hunger for now. She handed her son a small piece of dried meat, watching as he tore into it with the quiet hunger of someone who had learned to go without. The hunter sat across from them, his back against the rock, his eyes still scanning the distance. He didn't eat, didn't rest. He never did. Mariah wanted to ask him about the past, about the life he had left behind, but she knew better. He didn't share those things. His silence was a wall, impenetrable and cold. But it wasn't just his silence that unsettled her. It was the way he carried himself, the way he made her feel like she was always one step behind. She had put her trust in him, but what did that really mean? What had she agreed to when she said she would follow him? She shook the thoughts from her mind, focusing instead on her children. They were safe, for now. That was all that mattered. "How much longer?" she finally asked, unable to keep the question inside. The hunter glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Not long," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "We have to keep moving." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her chest tighten. She had no idea where they were going, only that the journey seemed endless. But she didn't have a choice. They had to keep moving forward, no matter where it led. She glanced over at her children, their faces tired but determined. For them, she would keep going, no matter what. The hunter stood, moving toward his horse without another word. Mariah stood as well, helping her children mount their horses. The time for resting was over. The road ahead was long, and there was no telling what awaited them. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. The hunter was right. They had to keep moving. And so they did. The days blurred together as they continued to move through the unforgiving landscape. The hours stretched long, and every moment felt like they were one step closer to danger. Mariah could feel the tension in her bones, the exhaustion settling deeper each time they stopped. But they couldn't afford to slow down. The hunter had been right. The raiders were closing in. She could feel it in the air, in the way the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. They had come so far, but she knew it wasn't enough. They had to keep moving. They had to stay ahead. The rocky outcrops and jagged cliffs gave way to more open terrain, the vast plains stretching endlessly before them. The sky above was a dull gray, clouds hanging low as if the heavens themselves were bracing for something. The wind had picked up, its cold bite making every step more difficult. Mariah wrapped her cloak tighter around her shoulders, trying to block out the chill, but it was more than just the cold that made her shiver. She was cold inside, too. She had trusted the hunter, put her faith in his ability to protect them, but every passing moment seemed to raise more questions than answers. Who was he really? Why had he chosen to protect them? And what would happen when they couldn't outrun the danger any longer? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp whistle from the hunter. He had stopped ahead, his body still, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Mariah's heart skipped a beat. She quickly urged her children to follow her, the urgency in the hunter's stance making her pulse quicken. As they reached him, she saw what had caught his attention. A small group of riders, barely visible against the horizon, were making their way across the plains. They moved with the confidence of men who had a purpose, men who knew exactly where they were going. The raiders. They had found them. The hunter's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw, a readiness in his posture that made Mariah's stomach tighten. "We need to move," he said, his voice low but firm. Now. They didn't have time to think. The hunter turned his horse and urged it into motion, Mariah following closely behind. The wind whipped at her face, but she kept her focus on the path ahead, on the safety of her children. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of how close they were to the edge. As they rode, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance, the raiders' pursuit unmistakable. Mariah's eyes darted to the side, scanning the plains for any sign of a safe haven, but there was nothing. Just open land, stretching on for miles. The hunter's figure remained steady in front of her, his posture rigid as he guided his horse through the terrain with ease. Mariah wished she could feel that kind of certainty, that kind of confidence. But she didn't. She couldn't. All she had was the hope that they could keep ahead of the raiders just long enough to find shelter. As the minutes passed, the sound of the hooves grew louder, and Mariah's pulse quickened. They were closing in. "We need to find cover," the hunter said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it cut through the noise like a sharp blade. Mariah's heart skipped a beat. She had been hoping they would make it to safety before the raiders reached them, but now she knew it wasn't possible. The hunter's plan was to keep moving, to stay ahead of them for as long as they could. "There," the hunter said, pointing toward a small group of rocks ahead. They were jagged and scattered, offering little in the way of shelter, but it was all they had. Mariah nodded, urging her horse forward. Her children, exhausted and fearful, clung to her, but she knew they couldn't slow down. The raiders were too close. They reached the rocks just as the sound of the hooves grew deafening. The hunter dismounted quickly, moving with the same speed and precision he always had. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "I'll draw them away." Mariah's breath caught in her throat. "No," she said, her voice cracking. "You can't." But the hunter didn't listen. He was already moving, his horse galloping off into the distance. Mariah's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts racing. The man she had trusted, the man who had protected them all this time, was leaving her. He was putting himself in harm's way to save them. She wanted to call out to him, to beg him to come back, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't. She couldn't risk drawing attention to herself. She turned to her children, holding them close, her hands trembling as she whispered, "We'll be all right. We have to stay quiet. We have to stay hidden." The sound of the raiders' horses was now just beyond the rocks. Mariah could hear their voices, low and guttural, but she didn't dare move. She didn't dare breathe too loudly. Every second felt like an eternity, but somehow, time seemed to slow as the raiders drew nearer. She could feel the cold sweat on her brow, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could only pray that the hunter was doing what he had promised, that he was buying them the time they needed. The silence of the rocks was deafening, broken only by the faintest rustling of leaves in the wind. Mariah clutched her children to her chest, the weight of her own breath the only sound she could hear. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, but there was nothing to see except the dark outline of the rocks and the growing shadows of the evening. The hunter had ridden off, disappearing into the distance to draw the raiders away. Mariah had no idea how long he would be gone, or how long it would take for the danger to pass. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat a reminder that she was no longer in control of her fate. Her children, sensing the fear in her, clung tighter to her, their small hands trembling. She whispered soft words of comfort to them, but her voice was shaky. She couldn't help but feel the deep sense of dread gnawing at her. The world outside their small shelter seemed to close in on them, the silence too loud. It felt like the calm before a storm. Time dragged on, minutes feeling like hours as they huddled together, waiting in the dark. Mariah could hear the distant sounds of hooves, but they were faint, too faint to be the raiders. She dared not move, not a single inch. The hunter had given them this moment, this brief window of safety, and she had to hold on to it. She breathed deeply, trying to steady her nerves, but it was impossible. The stillness around her was suffocating. Then, the distant sounds grew louder. Hooves. Voices. The raiders were closing in. Mariah's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively pulled her children closer, burying their faces into her cloak. Her heart pounded as the sounds drew nearer, the voices low and harsh. She could hear the raiders laughing, their crude words cutting through the quiet. There was no way to tell how many of them there were, but Mariah knew that they had to be close. She tightened her grip on her children, her mind racing. What if the hunter couldn't get them away in time? What if they were trapped here? Panic surged through her, and for a moment, she thought she might break. But then she remembered the promise she had made to herself and to her children, to keep them safe, no matter the cost. She had trusted the hunter, and now it was time to trust in that choice. She had no other options. The raiders' voices grew louder, closer. Mariah could feel the tension rising, her muscles coiling in fear. The moment of peace was over. The world outside their hiding place felt like a trap closing in on them, and every second that passed made it harder to hold on to the hope that they would survive. Just as she thought they would be discovered, she heard something. A faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, but then louder, a shout. A command. The hunter. He had returned. Relief flooded through Mariah, but it was short-lived. The sound of hooves was unmistakable now, coming fast and hard, but not from the direction of the raiders. The hunter had come back, and he had brought something with him. The raiders, too, were aware of the shift in the air. Their voices became frantic, shouting to each other, trying to regroup, but the hunter was already making his move. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the air, followed by the sound of galloping hooves. Mariah's heart skipped a beat, but she stayed frozen, her children clutched tightly to her. Another shot rang out, this time closer, followed by the unmistakable sound of men shouting in confusion. The hunter was leading them away, drawing their attention. Mariah could feel the shift, the way the world seemed to realign itself as the hunter took control. The raiders had fallen for it. They were distracted, chasing after the sounds of the gunfire, away from her and the children. She held her breath, listening as the sounds grew fainter, the hoofbeats less urgent. Time passed in agonizing silence. But then, just as suddenly as the noise had started, it stopped. The hunter had done it. He had kept his promise. He had drawn the raiders away. Mariah exhaled slowly, the tension finally easing from her shoulders. Her heart was still racing, but the immediate danger had passed. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the noise before, but this time, it was the silence of safety. The hunter appeared moments later, his figure emerging from the shadows. He looked tired, but unharmed. His face was still as unreadable as ever, but his eyes met Mariah's with a quiet certainty. "We're safe for now," he said, his voice calm. "But we need to keep moving. They'll regroup soon." Mariah nodded, though her body was still shaking from the adrenaline. She couldn't speak. Words felt too heavy right now, and all she could do was focus on the present, on getting her children to safety. She stood up slowly, pulling her children close to her. The hunter moved to his horse, quickly preparing to leave. Mariah followed his lead, her children in tow. There was no time for rest, no time for hesitation. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they were moving toward survival. The hunter had kept them safe, but now the fight was far from over. She had to keep trusting him, keep moving forward. It was the only choice they had left. The night was dark, the only sounds the rustle of the wind and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. Mariah's eyes scanned the horizon, the weight of their flight pressing down on her. They had made it through the worst of the danger, but the hunter's words still echoed in her mind. "We need to keep moving." They were still on the run, still caught in the perilous game between survival and being caught. The hunter led the way once more, his silhouette barely visible in the shadows of the trees, his movements sure and confident. Mariah followed, her children close behind her. They had been on the move for days now, with no rest but what the hunter allowed during brief stops. His vigilance never wavered, and neither did hers. She had learned to trust him, but even as they rode through the silent night, her mind kept returning to the same thoughts. Was this the life they would lead now? Always running? The road ahead seemed endless, and each step they took away from the danger only led them closer to the unknown. What would happen when they reached the end of the road? Would they finally be free? Or would the raiders catch up to them and put an end to everything they had fought for? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp noise ahead, a distant thud that set her heart racing. She glanced at the hunter, whose body had gone completely still. He raised his hand, signaling for silence, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the darkness. Mariah's breath caught in her throat. The fear that had been a constant companion in the past few days flooded her once more. The raiders? Or something worse? The hunter remained motionless, his focus sharp. A moment passed. Another thud echoed through the night, closer now. Then, the unmistakable sound of hooves. Mariah's stomach clenched. She couldn't see them, but she could feel their presence. Her heart hammered against her chest as the sounds grew nearer, the pounding of hooves growing louder. They were close. The hunter shifted, moving towards a small thicket nearby. He gestured for Mariah to follow, and she did without question. The children huddled behind her, their faces pale and full of fear. Mariah's pulse quickened. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. The hunter was trying to lead them out of danger once more. She trusted him. She had no choice but to. The sounds of the hooves were almost deafening now. The raiders, or whoever they were right on top of them. Mariah held her breath, praying that they wouldn't be seen, that the hunter's plan would work. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they crouched silently, every muscle in her body tense, her eyes fixed on the hunter. He was looking at her now, his face barely visible in the moonlight. He held up his hand again, signaling for them to stay quiet. The children remained still, their wide eyes reflecting their fear. Mariah barely dared to breathe. The riders' voices were now audible, low and gruff, but just enough to be heard. The raiders were passing, too close for comfort, their presence a constant reminder of how fragile their survival was. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the riders began to move away. The thudding of hooves grew fainter until the sound was almost gone. The hunter remained where he was, motionless, listening. Mariah waited, her breath caught in her throat, her heart still racing. Seconds passed, then minutes. The hooves were gone, but the tension in the air remained. Finally, the hunter stood and motioned for them to move. "We're clear," he whispered, his voice calm but urgent. Mariah exhaled a shaky breath, feeling the weight of the last few minutes settle in. They had narrowly escaped. Again. But how many more times could they do this? How many more times would the hunter's luck hold out? She didn't know. But they had survived, and for now, that was enough. The hunter led them forward, moving quickly but cautiously. They kept to the shadows, staying off the main paths, avoiding the open fields where they would be exposed. They didn't speak, each of them aware of the danger that still loomed over them. The tension was palpable, the fear that had once been an occasional visitor, now a constant companion. Mariah kept her children close, her hands wrapped around them, her thoughts focused only on keeping them safe. The world outside seemed to press in on them, the weight of the chase bearing down on her shoulders. The hunter led them toward a small cluster of trees, their thick trunks offering some protection from the view of anyone who might be watching. "We rest here," he said, his voice low and steady. "Keep quiet." Mariah nodded, though her mind was still racing. They couldn't stay here long, she knew that. Every moment spent in one place was a moment the raiders could use to track them down. The children, exhausted from the long ride and the tension of the night, sat down at her feet, their eyes closing as they tried to rest. But Mariah couldn't sleep. She sat with her back against a tree, her eyes scanning the darkness, every nerve in her body on high alert. She had never imagined her life would come to this, a life of running, always running. But now, it was the only life she knew. The hunter's voice broke through her thoughts. "We move at dawn," he said. "Get what rest you can." Mariah nodded again, the words sinking in. The hunt was far from over, and they had to keep going. There was no other choice. The first rays of light broke over the horizon, casting a pale glow on the rugged landscape. The darkness of the night was still thick in the air, but the hunter had already begun to stir, his movements purposeful and deliberate. Mariah could feel the weight of the past few days pressing down on her. They had made it through another night, another close call, but the fear in her chest hadn't dissipated. It was a quiet kind of fear now, a fear that had settled deep within her, knowing that their survival was always on the edge. The hunter stood, his silhouette sharp against the soft morning light. He didn't speak right away, but his eyes met hers, as if measuring something only he could understand. Mariah had grown used to his silence, to the way he communicated with his actions more than his words. It was a strange thing to witness, the way he kept them alive with such unspoken confidence. The children were still asleep, their small bodies huddled together under the makeshift blanket, but it wouldn't be long before they woke, hungry and weary from the journey. Mariah glanced at the hunter, her mind still caught between gratitude and the unanswered questions that had lingered since they first met. "We move out in 15 minutes, he said finally, his voice low but clear. Mariah nodded, though her mind raced. She had learned to trust him, but as the days wore on, She couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they couldn't run anymore. They had been on the move for so long, jumping from one place to the next, never staying long enough to build anything permanent. She wanted so badly to believe that they could find safety, that there was a future beyond this constant flight, but each time they evaded one danger, another seemed to be right behind them. The hunter's voice cut through her thoughts again. "Wake them up." Mariah stood slowly, stretching her stiff limbs. She moved to the children, shaking them gently. They blinked sleepily, their faces still soft with the innocence of youth, unaware of the weight of the world pressing in on them. "Come on, little ones," Mariah said softly. "We have to keep moving." The children sat up, their eyes wide with the confusion that always followed their waking moments. They hadn't known anything else but the constant threat of danger, and yet there was a strange sense of peace in their quiet moments together. Mariah helped them pack what little they had left, careful not to make too much noise. The hunter, ever watchful, didn't seem to take his eyes off the surrounding land for even a moment. It was hard to imagine what it must be like for him. Always watching, always waiting for the next threat. She wished she could see the world through his eyes, to understand what drove him, but that kind of understanding had remained just out of reach. With the children ready and the small camp packed, Mariah gave the hunter one last glance. He was already on his horse, ready to go. His steely eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw something flicker there, something that felt almost like acknowledgement. Without another word, he spurred his horse into motion, and Mariah followed. The day stretched on before them, but the tension in the air was undeniable. The road ahead was uncertain, the danger ever present. The wind whipped across the plains, carrying with it the smell of earth and dust. Mariah kept her children close, watching as the landscape unfolded before them, vast, empty, and treacherous. As the hours passed, the world around them seemed to grow quieter, as if the very land was holding its breath. The hunter never slowed, never faltered, his eyes scanning the distance constantly. He didn't seem to tire, didn't seem to feel the weight of the journey. Mariah, on the other hand, felt every step, every mile they put between themselves and the past. She could feel the strain in her muscles, the exhaustion creeping into her bones. She had never been one for weakness, but after everything they had been through, it was hard not to feel overwhelmed. She stole a glance at her children, their faces streaked with dirt, but still full of hope. They were the reason she couldn't stop, the reason she kept moving. They had to survive. They had to have a chance. She couldn't fail them. The hunter's sharp voice broke through her thoughts. "Stay close." It was a simple command, but one that carried with it a weight of meaning. The hunter had said they would stop for the night soon, but they weren't safe yet. As the light began to fade, they found a small cluster of trees, offering some cover. The hunter dismounted first, scanning the area before giving the all-clear. Mariah followed his lead, helping her children dismount and guiding them to the base of a large tree. "We'll rest here," the hunter said, "but we move before first light." Mariah nodded, her exhaustion catching up to her. She sat down beside her children, keeping them close. She had no illusions about what would happen if they were caught, but in this moment, all she could do was hold them, keep them close, and hope the hunter could get them through the night. The world around them grew darker, the air colder, but for now, they were safe. She had to believe that. The wind was biting, a cold gust that whipped through the trees and stung Mariah's face, but she barely noticed. They had been on the move for days, exhaustion weighing down her every step. The small shelter they had found under the cluster of trees offered little comfort, yet it was enough for now. The children had fallen asleep, their bodies curled against her for warmth, their innocent faces a stark contrast to the danger they were still running from. The hunter, as always, kept his distance, sitting across the small campfire with his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding wilderness. His presence was a quiet constant, like a shadow that never left. Mariah glanced at him now, watching the firelight dance across his rugged face, the weariness in his eyes. For a moment, she wondered what it was like for him to live a life so consumed by danger, so focused on survival. He had never spoken of his past, never given her any indication of who he truly was before this. He was a man of few words, of even fewer emotions, yet somehow, he had become her protector, the one constant in a life that seemed to be built on uncertainty. She wanted to ask him about his past, about why he had chosen this path, but she knew better. He didn't want to talk about it. The thought of him, of them, being together in the same world seemed like a dream. For so long, she had lived with the comfort of knowing where she belonged, until now. Everything had been upended in a moment, and now they were just running, living from one day to the next. The hunter met her gaze now, his eyes soft, but unreadable. "We'll have to leave before dawn," he said, his voice low, as always. Mariah nodded. She didn't need to ask why. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The raiders were relentless, and every step they took away from them only brought them closer to the unknown. "I know," she replied, her voice steady, though she could feel the tightness in her chest. She didn't want to think about the next move, the next obstacle they would have to face. She just wanted to breathe, to let herself believe for a moment that maybe, just maybe, they could be free of this. The fire crackled, and the shadows of the night seemed to stretch longer as the silence between them grew. The hunter looked at the ground, his face obscured in shadow, and for the first time, Mariah saw something she hadn't noticed before. There was a weariness in him, too, something deeper than the exhaustion they all carried. Maybe it wasn't just the weight of survival that haunted them. It was the weight of everything they had lost. "You're wondering how long this will last, aren't you?" the hunter said, breaking the silence. Mariah blinked, taken aback by the unexpected question. She didn't answer right away, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't spoken her fears aloud, but the thought had crossed her mind more than once. "I'm not sure how much longer we can keep running," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The hunter didn't respond right away, but the look in his eyes told her everything. They were both thinking the same thing. They couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face the truth that there was no escaping this life, no escaping the danger that hung over them like a dark cloud. The hunter shifted, standing slowly. He reached out to the fire, adjusting the logs to keep it burning. "We've come this far," he said, his voice quieter now. "And we'll keep going. We keep moving forward, because that's all we can do." His words hung in the air like a promise, a simple one, but one that Mariah needed to hear. She nodded, her gaze dropping to her children as they slept, oblivious to the world around them. They had come so far, but the journey wasn't over. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, all she could do was keep moving. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, "we move." The hunter glanced back at her, a slight nod of agreement. There were no words of comfort, no false promises. Only the truth. They had to survive, no matter the cost. The night passed in silence, the wind still howling through the trees. Mariah stayed close to her children, her mind still racing, her heart heavy with the uncertainty of what was to come. She had no illusions about their situation. She didn't know how much longer they could keep this up, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never give up on them. She would never stop trying to keep them safe. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows over their faces. The hunter moved silently to check their surroundings, his eyes always scanning the darkness. And for a moment, as the wind whispered through the trees, Mariah allowed herself to close her eyes and dream of a life without fear, a life where they were free. But it was just a dream. Tomorrow would come, and they would move again, just as they had before. But for tonight, they were still alive, and that was enough. Immerse yourself in thrilling Western stories that bring the rugged frontier to life. This captivating journey follows a widow and her children as they fight for survival in a world filled with danger, unrelenting enemies, and the harsh realities of life on the run. In these intense Western stories, a mysterious hunter becomes their only hope for survival, leading them through treacherous landscapes while staying one step ahead of the ruthless raiders who pursue them. As the stakes rise, the bond between the widow and the hunter grows stronger, but with danger at every turn, trust becomes a fragile thing. Experience the tension, heartache, and triumph in these unforgettable Western stories, as each chapter reveals the true cost of survival in the Wild West. In these compelling Western stories, the constant pursuit of safety is intertwined with moments of hope, courage, and sacrifice. Will they ever escape the constant threat, or will the unforgiving world claim them? These powerful Western stories are filled with heart-pounding action, emotional depth, and characters who refuse to give up no matter the cost. Don't miss out on these gripping Western stories. where every decision could be their last, and survival is the only thing that matters.